Starting as a beginner painter in the hobby of model painting can be very intimidating, and there are not very many good videos on where to start. When I was beginning, I was very lost. It was very difficult, and I hope to rectify that with a very simple video on my recommended products that you want when you're starting off model painting. And this will apply for Warhammer and Dungeons & Dragons, any sort of model painting. But I will specifically focus on where to get D&D models later in this video. So, with that, let's just get right into it. I've tried a lot of different paint brands. I started off with a Vallejo starter set for fantasy models, and it was okay. But I highly recommend the Army Painter Fanatic starter set. Now, this paint line has a lot of hype around it, and I don't think it's hype for the right reasons, but it's still amazing. It's still fantastic. It's good. I highly recommend you get that. And with that said, there is no perfect starter set, so you're going to find very quickly that you're going to need more paints, more colors. I find I use a lot of purples. I find that I use a lot of browns. Once again, you'll discover what you like to use and what you'll want more of by actually using this set, but yeah, I recommend it. Next, primer. The starter set, I said, does include brush-on primer, which you thin down with a bit of water and carefully paint all over your model. Primer is very important. It helps paint stick to the model. I painted without primer for a little while, and it was very frustrating. Please prime your models. And if you want, and I recommend this, try getting spray-on primer. They'll sell this at hardware stores to spray on furniture and stuff. Try to find one that's thin, ask around, I'm sure the employees will help, and spray your models outside, tape them to, use a bit of sticky tack or tape them to a piece of cardboard and spray them. Don't spray too close. It's an art, but you can spray too much on and destroy all your model's detail. Just be careful with it. A light coat, they don't need to be fully covered, just most of it, so the paint can stick easier. Next, brushes. So I use these very cheap Mod Podge brushes on Amazon. They're these fine detail ones. They're great. I don't feel bad about destroying them because they will get destroyed eventually. And always save your brushes, because destroyed brushes have their uses still, which we can talk about later. Next, a palette. I just used this hard palette I got from the Army Painter Speed Paints starter set. I used a plastic plate up until then that I, replaced every so often. I also have a wet palette, but it doesn't matter what you use. You can buy any sort of hard palette that's plastic or metal or, just a paper plate. It's your preference. You'll need a cup of some kind, doesn't have to be fancy, paper towels. That will be very useful for drying off your brush. And a hobby knife, which I'll put up here. They're like $5 on Amazon. You can get nicer ones for $10. Very, very useful in this hobby. You'll need super glue. Everyone has super glue, I think, though. As well as, and I highly recommend this, some kind of varnish. You can thin this down with a bit of clean water and do a light coat over your models. And it's kind of like think of like a person sealed in a plastic coat. Except your models don't need to breathe, so they'll be okay. It's a shell around your models that helps protect them from fall damage, people damage, and Cheeto dust damage. Highly recommend it. With all my recommendations, I know the hobby can be expensive, very expensive, so you don't need to get them right away, but I recommend getting them as soon as possible. And another nice recommendation are more washes. They're talent in a bottle. They're super useful. I'll talk about them more in a different video. Let's review real quick everything I recommend. So, the Army Painter Fanatic starter set,
rattle can primer,
a hobby knife, the Mod Podge cheap Amazon brushes, a paper plate or a hard palette if you really want to get one, acrylic varnish, so I'll specifically specify I like using Liquitex because it's very cheap for the amount you get. I've had this thing for 3 years, and I've only used this much. And using my airbrush, I've sprayed a lot of models with this to protect them, so I use it a lot. And I would recommend you get washes, but once again, that can wait. So, nice and easy, hopefully concise. Next, where to get models. So, if you're playing a war game, just get them straight from the company. But also eBay. You can check for any sort of war game, and generally, they have cheaper prices or people are selling off their armies. Look around. You can find some great stuff. That's how I didn't break the bank while building my Death Guard army. for Warhammer. But D&D models. So where do you get them? So overall, I thought about putting a few different companies here, but honestly, the best one by far is Reaper. So their models are very cheap. You get free shipping over $100, and they throw in a bunch of free models. So for beginners specifically, they're bone range. So these are white plastic models that are fairly low detail, and they're extraordinarily cheap. That's the key. Very cheap, great for beginners. It's not as intimidating. There's less analysis paralysis because there's less detail on the models, and they still look great painted. If you're feeling a little more advanced, or if there's a really cool monster, I recommend looking at the Bones Black line. It's a nicer plastic. There's way more detail. I personally really like them. And if you're feeling adventurous, and I don't recommend getting like multi-part kits, so like the arms aren't attached, the legs aren't attached, you have to attach them yourself. I don't recommend multi-part kits for beginners, but metal models are fantastic. I do recommend you take a little bit of soap and a toothbrush, a nice stiff one, and scrub them down and let them dry before you paint them, just to make sure there's no residue on them. But they're very cool too. And Reaper sells them all at a very affordable price, considering the hobby and model painting. And yeah, I honestly think you should just go with them. However, you will want to branch out. And there are a lot of cool other companies too. Like, I really like Otherworld's models. They make super old school metal D&D models that are awesome. They're in the UK though, so they're really expensive. There's Ralpartha Legacy, which recasts old models made by Ralpartha, who was the guy who really started sculpting good models back in the day for D&D. They're really cool. I actually paint some showcase models for them. And there's also Nulzer's Marvelous Models. I think that's pronounced right. Essentially, they're partnered with Wizards of the Coast, so they make official models based off of the 5th edition art. Personally, it's not my style. I'm not the biggest fan, but for beginners or people who want copyrighted D&D monsters, it's very useful. I will say I do like their dragons because they're very affordable. Their big monsters are very affordable. I don't think their smaller monsters are exactly worth it to buy, but they're pre-primed, they're very beginner friendly, so you may want to take a look at them too. But with that is my lightning round of advice for new painters on what to buy when starting out. I will be uploading another video later in the week that is a very basic painting tutorial. It'll teach you all the basic techniques you need to know to paint good looking models, so I highly recommend you stick around and check that out. But with that, this is my second time recording this because I rambled for 18 minutes in the first one. So, you all have a nice day. Thanks for coming and checking me out, and I hope to see you in the next video.